Hello, students. Hope you are having a wonderful winter holiday, or at this point, hope you had a wonderful winter holiday. We're excited that you are back, and uh, we can't wait to hear some of the awesome stories. Today, we're going to be talking about the 1920s, which really created an American culture. So we could talk about it as the birth of an American culture. And a lot of cultural changes that came from it. The first thing I want to do is I want to draw your attention to this slideshow, which you each should either have a paper copy of that you've printed out, or a digital copy was given to you most likely via Google Classroom. On it has slides in which you are going to be, as we talk about some of the people and the influencers, is going to be asking you to fill in some information. So you'll fill in the blanks or the boxes as we go. I'm going to draw your attention to these two slides about the people of the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance. On each slide, it's going to have text boxes with a number of bullet points. The number of bullet points is how many pieces of information we feel that from the video you should be able to incorporate. So just make sure that on the left-hand side, we're going to be talking about names or people or the main idea, and on the right-hand side in this text box, you'll have specific pieces of work or examples of what they did that made them important at this time. So let's get started. Today, like I said, the 1920s, we call it the birth of an American culture. What that composed of, and on your first slide, really composed of three things. First was music, right? Music became really popular around this time, and we'll talk more about that in just a few moments. Art was another component of this movement, as well as then literature and poetry, right? Literature being writing, works of writing by some famous authors, and poetry by some famous poets. These new inventions that we've heard about previously from previous lessons, new inventions of this time, as well as these passions, music, art, and writing, these hobbies, combined with that increase in leisure or free time, led to the growth of the entertainment industry. So we saw, for example, Hollywood and the movie industry grow around this time. And the sports industry, baseball, for example, became very, very popular at this time. So let's talk about some people of the 1920s. So when we talk about people, we're going to divide it between two different types of culture, right? Specifically, white culture and African American culture, right? And we're going to talk about those two slides because they really brought two unique perspectives to art, music, and literature, for example. So people of the 1920s, obviously we talked about the big idea here is that in the 1920s and the 30s were important decades because art, literature, and music became so prominent. Some of these artists and influencers changed society, for example. They often would express the American experience with beauty, truth, and creativity. So talking about things like the American dream and really showing what it was like to be American at this time. Some people, obviously, and like I said, we're going to break it up into three categories. First are writers, right? Authors of this time. What authors would do in their writing, they would capture the flavor of life in the United States. So some notable people of this time period, right, are F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Steinbeck. F. Scott Fitzgerald was known for his novel, The Great Gatsby, about the empty prosperity of the Jazz Age, right, really on the emptiness of what life in the United States was like. As well as then John Steinbeck wrote portraying the strength of migrant workers. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath, really. So we have two different sides of perspective of what these writers were capturing about the 1920s. Next, we're going to talk about musical composers. So some musical composers that were known for writing really what we consider uniquely American music were two guys, Aaron Copland and George Gershwin. Two of their most notable works from each of them, right? Aaron Copland was known for writing a composition named Rodeo and Appalachian Spring. George Gershwin, was known for writing An American in Paris and Rhapsody in Blue. We're going to listen to some of these over the next few days, and you'll recognize possibly some of them from major media commercials that they might have been played in. Following that, right, we have, art. Art became huge. One of the most well-known artists at this time was Georgia O'Keeffe, right? And she really captured, what American cities looked like. So she would paint urban scenes to try and capture, the vibrant nightlife, as you can see in this painting to the right, as well as pictures of the Southwest, right? Southwest being states like Arizona, California, New Mexico, and capture those in her paintings. Those were, again, what we consider, one side of the culture spectrum. But then we're going to talk about the next side of this culture spectrum. We're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. What the Harlem Renaissance was, to give you some context or some background on this topic, is really the same thing. It's writing, music, literature, art coming from African American culture. So it really drew upon the heritage of black culture to create a powerful force for change in society, right? And so again, they, similarly to some of the other people, influenced change and changed society by revealing the freshness and variety of African American culture. Some musicians that we're going to talk about today, right? And really, when we say music coming from the Harlem Renaissance, was jazz, right? So there's a lot of jazz instrumentalists, these jazz musical instruments, composers, and singers of blues music, for example. And while it started in Harlem, right? It started in this small neighborhood in New York City called Harlem. It grew throughout, right? It grew throughout the United States and then eventually kind of into Europe, right? And impacted the culture over there, right? So some musicians we saw, such as Duke Ellington, who was known for his piano performances, Bessie Smith, who was a prominent blues singer, and she became known as the Empress of the Blues, and Louis Armstrong, as you can see in this picture right here, and his trumpet performances. When we move on to poetry, right? Poetry, what its goal was to celebrate African American culture and often would reflect the sounds of the day, right? So we have the jazz music, and so this poetry kind of takes the same tone on its verbiage, right? One of the main poets of this time that we're going to talk about, Langston Hughes, right? Langston Hughes has a school named after himself in Fairfax County, the Langston Hughes Middle School, and two of his more well-known poems that kind of captured and celebrated African American culture were, one, The Weary Blues, and two, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Moving on, right, we have art as well. So around this time, art became huge, and as we learned previously, the Great Migration, in which many African Americans were escaping or leaving their life in the South and moving to more prominent pastures in the North, right? We have an artist who kind of captured that and chronicled the movement, what we call the Great Migration, through a series of 60 paintings, Jacob Lawrence. And as you can kind of see in this painting here, we have, African Americans leaving, moving in and kind of funneling their way into Chicago in the north, New York in the north, and then St. Louis as well. And kind of comparing it in another painting up here, up top, comparing it to how birds migrate, moving for whatever circumstance to find better opportunities. So, and as we think about this art, music, and literature, both coming out of Harlem and out of other places, we can kind of connect and note how this culture was created and why the 1920s really became known as the Jazz Age, as well as the Roaring Twenties. A lot of vibrant culture came out of it and is tied to this writing, to this music, and to this art. We hope you learned something, and we look forward to extending this activity in class tomorrow or in the next few days, and we hope that you take away some valuable information. Feel free to go back and pause the video at any point if you need to review any of the previous information. Thanks. Have a great day.